throwing streaks of light onto the worn-out benches. On one of them sat Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman from Texas's 30th District, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering fight for justice. Her dark gray suit was impeccably pressed, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion, not the physical kind, but the kind that accumulates from endless battles with the system. Today, she wasn't standing at the podium in Congress. Today, she stood before Judge Henry Walsh, a 68-year-old veteran of the judicial system, whose graying beard and mocking gaze made him look like an old sheriff from a Western. The case was high-profile, and for people over 55 in the U.S. who remembered the racial protests of the 60s and the political scandals of the 70s, it echoed the past. A local activist, 24-year-old Tyler Brown, had filed a lawsuit against the Dallas police, claiming he was unlawfully detained and beaten during a peaceful protest against a new zoning law rumored to benefit only wealthy developers. Jasmine was representing Tyler as his attorney, not because she needed another burden, but because she saw it as part of a bigger fight, a fight for those whom the system always pushes to the margins. Judge Walsh, known for his conservatism and love for theatrical gestures, leaned back in his chair and looked at Jasmine with a barely restrained smirk. His voice, hoarse from decades of smoking cigars, boomed through the courtroom. "Miss Crockett, do you really think this activist of yours is worth my time? A guy with a sign and a megaphone against the police department." He snorted, and a few jurors, older men in worn-out jackets, hid their smiles behind their hands. Jasmine felt the blood rush to her face, but her voice remained as steady as steel. "Your Honor, Tyler Brown has a right to justice, just like everyone in this room. The police violated his First Amendment rights. I have evidence, video footage, witnesses, medical reports. You can laugh, but that won't change the facts." Walsh rolled his eyes and waved a hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "Oh, spare me the dramatic speech, Congresswoman. You're not in the Capitol in front of CNN cameras. I've seen these cases 1,000 times, another rebel trying to play the hero. Show me something that won't put me to sleep." The courtroom erupted in laughter. Prosecutors, a few reporters, even some jurors couldn't hold back. Jasmine clenched her fists under the table, feeling her nails dig into her palms. She knew Walsh was performing for the audience, knew that to him. This was just another day in his little kingdom. But she also knew that Tyler, sitting beside her with bruises still darkening his gaunt face, didn't deserve this humiliation. "All right, Your Honor," she said, standing up. Her voice was calm, but there was a force in it that made the laughter die down. "If you want evidence, I'll give you evidence. But first tell me, when was the last time you looked into the eyes of someone the system had broken and saw not just a rebel, but someone's child, someone's hope?" Walsh leaned forward, his smirk fading. "Careful, Miss Crockett. You're not here to give lectures." "I'm here for justice," she replied, meeting his gaze head-on. "And I will prove that Tyler isn't a rebel. He's a voice, and you will hear him." Silence filled the room. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hum more quietly. Tyler looked at Jasmine with a mix of fear and awe, while the prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, nervously shuffled his papers. Walsh leaned back, raising an eyebrow, but said nothing. Jasmine knew she had struck a nerve, not because he suddenly sided with her, but because he hadn't expected such a calm yet firm resistance. The next hours were grueling. Jasmine presented body camera footage showing 2 officers dragging Tyler across the asphalt while he screamed that he wasn't resisting. She called a witness, 62-year-old Marion Collins, a retired teacher who had been standing just a few feet away from the incident and had heard one of the officers call Tyler just another one of those loud-mouthed Negroes. Mary Ann, with trembling hands and silver hair tied in a tight bun, spoke softly but firmly. "I grew up in a time when this happened every day. I thought we were past it. But that boy, he was just holding a sign. They had no right." The jurors, especially the older ones, shifted in their seats. To them, Mary Ann's words weren't just testimony. They were echoes of their own past, memories of seeing neighbors taken away for the color of their skin or the courage to speak. Walsh, however, remained unmoved. He interrupted Jasmine, asked skeptical questions, and occasionally threw in sarcastic remarks. "Oh, so now we have a civil war over one guy with a sign? Maybe we should build him a statue." Jasmine didn't waver. She responded with facts, statistics, precedents. Her voice remained steady, but every word carried weight, the weight of someone who knew that behind her stood not just Tyler, but an entire generation tired of staying silent. By the end of the day, the courtroom was electric. Reporters whispered, jurors exchanged glances, and Walsh, though still keeping his smug tone, seemed less certain. When Jasmine sat down, Tyler grabbed her hand and whispered, "Do you think they'll believe me?" "They'll believe the truth," she replied softly. "And I'll make sure they hear it." But the worst was yet to come. The next day, the prosecutor called Officer Randall Cox, one of the officers who had arrested Tyler. Cox, a stocky man with cropped gray hair and the posture of a veteran, entered the courtroom with the confidence of someone who knew the system was always on his side. He sat down, folded his hands, and started telling his version of the story. Tyler had allegedly shouted, shoved, and lunged at the officers. Not a word about the beating. No hint of excessive force. Jasmine listened, her face unreadable, but inside a storm raged. She knew Cox was lying. She knew the video contradicted his claims. But she also knew that the jurors, especially the older ones who had grown up in the law and order era, might believe an officer simply because he wore a uniform. When it was her turn to cross-examine Cox, she stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked toward him slowly, like a hunter approaching its prey. The room fell silent. Walsh leaned forward, ready for another round. Jasmine looked at Cox and said, "Officer Cox, you swore to tell the truth. So tell me, when Tyler Brown lunged at you, as you claim, where exactly was your body camera?" Cox hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough for Jasmine to smell blood. It was on," he muttered. "Wonderful," Jasmine said with a slight smile. "Then let's watch that footage again, in slow motion, and let the jury decide who lunged at whom." The room erupted in whispers. Walsh banged his gavel, but his eyes gleamed, not with anger, but with curiosity. He knew that Jasmine had just challenged not only Cox, but the entire system he represented. And he couldn't wait to see what happened next. The Dallas courtroom buzzed like a beehive as Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the projector. Her footsteps echoed dully against the wooden floor, the scent of coffee and paper mingling with the tension hanging in the air. The sun was already setting behind the windows, casting long shadows across the faces of the jurors, 12 men and women whose gazes wavered between skepticism and curiosity. Judge Walsh sat with his arms crossed, his gray beard barely trembling with restrained impatience. Officer Randall Cox, still confident in his uniform and years of authority, stared at Jasmine with an unmoving expression, but the bead of sweat rolling down his temple betrayed him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Jasmine began, her voice quiet but reaching every corner of the room. "You just heard Officer Cox claim that my client, Tyler Brown, lunged at him during the arrest. Let's examine that." She gestured toward the projector. "Here's the footage from Officer Cox's body camera, which he has kindly confirmed was recording." She pressed play. The screen flickered to life, revealing chaotic protest footage. Signs reading "Justice for All." A crowd shouts, the faint scent of smoke from a distant burning trash bin. The camera jostled wildly, but at its center, Tyler was clearly visible, thin, wearing a worn-out T-shirt, holding a protest sign. He was shouting something, but his hands remained lowered, his feet firmly on the ground. Then a sudden motion, an officer, Cox based on the camera's angle, grabbed Tyler's shoulder and yanked him down. Tyler screamed in pain, but did not resist. Another officer, his face out of frame, drove a knee into his stomach. Tyler collapsed, and for a moment, The camera captured the asphalt, splattered with blood. The courtroom gasped. Esther Moore, a 62-year-old black juror with deep lines on her face, covered her mouth with her hand. Her husband had been an activist in the 60s and had come home with broken ribs after a demonstration. She knew that sound, the sound of injustice striking flesh. Jasmine switched off the video and turned to Cox. "Officer, you said Tyler lunged at you. But all I see is a man standing still and then being thrown to the ground. Can you explain that?" Cox flushed, his fingers tightening around the witness stand. He was shouting, waving his arms. It was a threat. Waving his arms? Jasmine arched a brow. "Let's look again." She rewound the video and froze the frame where Tyler held a sign. His arms were still. Only his mouth moved, shouting slogans. "This is what you call waving." Her voice was calm, but each syllable cut like a blade. Prosecutor James Lindsay shot up from his seat. "Objection, Your Honor. She's intimidating the witness." Walsh raised a hand, but his eyes gleamed with interest. "Overruled. I'm curious where this is going." "Proceed, Ms. Crockett." Jasmine nodded and turned back to Cox. "So, officer, if Tyler wasn't resisting, why did you take him down? Why did your partner strike him? And why is none of this in your report?" Cox swallowed, his gaze darting around the room. "It was a chaotic situation. We followed protocol." "Protocol." Jasmine lifted a folder. "I have the Dallas Police Department's manual right here. Page 47, Section 3. Force is to be used only in cases of active resistance or threat to life." "What was the threat, officer?" "The sign." Silence blanketed the courtroom. Cox clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ground audibly. Walsh leaned forward, his usual smirk absent. "Answer, officer," he said, impatience creeping into his voice. I believed he could be dangerous," Cox muttered. "Could be." Jasmine let the words hang. "You assaulted a man over could be?" "Tell me, officer, how many others have you beaten over could be? And how many of them looked like Tyler, young, black, with a voice you didn't want to hear?" The room erupted in whispers. Jurors exchanged glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. Tyler sat with his fists clenched, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, but he never looked away from Jasmine. She was his shield, his voice, his chance. Lindsay sprang up again. "Your Honor, speculation. She's accusing the officer without evidence." "Evidence." Jasmine turned to him, her eyes blazing. "I have video witnesses, a medical report showing Tyler has 2 broken ribs." "What do you have, Mr. Lindsay?" "The word of an officer who just lied under oath." Walsh banged his gavel, but this time the motion was slower, less certain. "That's enough, Ms. Crockett. You've made your point. Sit down." Jasmine returned to her seat, her heart hammering, but her face remained unreadable. She knew she had just cracked the wall of lies, bias, and silence. But she also knew the fight was far from over. The next day, the courtroom was packed. Word of Cox's testimony had spread through Dallas, drawing everyone from activists to retirees who remembered marching for civil rights. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, like the air before a storm, sweat, rustling papers, hushed conversations. Walsh entered, looking grim, his gray beard heavier against his pale face. The prosecution called their next witness, Officer Andrew Harris, Cox's partner. Harris was younger, with a nervous smile and trembling hands as he took the oath. He repeated Cox's story nearly word for word. Tyler shouted, resisted, posed a threat. But Jasmine saw how he avoided her gaze, how his fingers gripped the edge of the stand. When her turn came, she approached him slowly, her heels clicking like a ticking clock counting down to an explosion. "Officer Harris," she began, "you've seen the video. You know Tyler wasn't resisting. Why did you assault a man who wasn't resisting?" Harris flicked a glance at Cox, then dropped his eyes. I followed orders. Whose orders? Jasmine tilted her head. Your partner's? Or the department's, which tells you to protect, not attack? I didn't want to, Harris blurted, his voice cracking. But Cox said we had to show force. That if we didn't stop people like him, we'd lose control. The room exploded. Reporters rushed to their phones. Jurors gasped. Walsh slammed his gavel, so hard the wood splintered. Order, he barked. But his eyes were locked on Jasmine. She didn't back down. She turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about Tyler. It's about what happens when force becomes more important than truth. When orders outweigh justice. You've seen the video. You've heard the witnesses. And now, you've heard the truth from the officer himself. What will you choose? Harris dropped his head, his shoulders trembling. Cox sat motionless, his face ashen. Walsh leaned back, his fingers tightening around his gavel, but he said nothing. Jasmine sat down, feeling the pulse in her temples. She had given the jury a choice between the old system and a new hope. But she also knew Walsh could twist things. That Lindsay would try to salvage Cox. That the system never surrendered without a fight. Tomorrow would be the final act, the closing arguments. And everyone in that courtroom, from Tyler to the jurors, from the reporters to Walsh himself, held their breath, waiting to see if Jasmine could. The courtroom in Dallas on the fourth day of a trial felt like a scorching furnace. The sun blazed through the windows, roasting the air, thick with the scent of sweat, old varnish, and tension humming like an electric current. The jurors sat with pursed lips, their eyes darting from Jasmine Crockett to Judge Walsh, then to Officers Cox and Harris, who looked as if they had just swallowed something sour. Tyler Brown sat beside Jasmine, his thin shoulders tense, but a faint spark of hope burned in his eyes, a spark Jasmine had kindled over these past days. Today was the day of closing arguments. Jasmine stood, her dark gray suit still immaculate, though a few strands of hair had escaped her neat hairstyle, adding a touch of humanity to her relentless strength. She looked at the jurors, at Esther Moore, whose eyes glistened with memories, at 70-year-old John Kelly, a Vietnam veteran who had kept his arms crossed throughout the trial but was now listening intently. She knew that these people, who had seen America in its darkest and brightest moments, held Tyler's fate in their hands. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice soft yet cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. You saw the video. You heard the witnesses. You heard Officer Harris admit that he struck Tyler not out of threat, but on orders. But this case isn't just about one boy with a sign. It's about what we choose to accept as normal. Is it normal to beat someone for their voice? Is it normal to stay silent when the truth is screaming before you? She paused, scanning the room. Walsh leaned forward, his gray beard trembling slightly, but his eyes burned with curiosity. Prosecutor Lindsay nervously shuffled papers, while Cox clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I could yell, I could accuse, I could demand, Jasmine continued. But I ask you for something simpler. Look at Tyler. Look at his face, his bruises, his hope. And ask yourself, was this what we fought for? Was this what you marched for in the 60s, Miss Esther? Was this what you served your country for, Mr. John? So that the system could crush those who dare to speak. Esther pressed her lips together, her eyes welling up. John slowly uncrossed his arms, his gaze softening for the first time during the trial. Jasmine turned back to the table, her voice rising half a tone but remaining steady. I believe in the truth. I believe in you. And I believe that even a small step toward justice can change everything. Thank you. She sat down, and the room erupted into whispers. Tyler grabbed her hand and whispered, Do you think they'll understand? They already do, she replied quietly, squeezing his palm. Prosecutor Lindsay stood, his arguments loud but empty. Law and order, officers under pressure, the danger of chaos. But his words felt like a broken record. The jurors had already heard the truth, and it had settled within them deeper than his shouting. Walsh called a recess, and the jury went to deliberate. The hours stretched endlessly. Jasmine sat with Tyler in the hallway, which smelled of disinfectant and vending machine coffee. She sipped water from a plastic cup, feeling her hands tremble, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "What if they choose them?" Tyler asked quietly. "Then we fight on," she replied. "But I don't think they'll choose the lie. Not after this." Finally, the doors opened, and the jury returned. The room held its breath. Esther Moore, selected as the jury foreperson, stood, her voice trembling but firm. "We have reached a verdict. We find the Dallas Police Department guilty of excessive force against Tyler Brown. We recommend compensation and disciplinary actions against Officers Cox and Harris." The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed to their phones. Tyler buried his face in his hands, and Jasmine felt tears sting her eyes but held them back. Walsh struck his gavel, his face unreadable, but a flicker of something like respect crossed his eyes. "The verdict is accepted," he declared. "The case is closed." But this wasn't the end. As people began to leave, Walsh called Jasmine to his bench. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You know, I don't agree with you, Crockett. But you made me listen, and I can't ignore that." Jasmine looked at him, surprised. "I didn't expect your agreement, Your Honor. Your attention was enough." He smirked, but this time without sarcasm. "You're dangerous, but maybe that's what we need." She nodded and walked away, feeling the weight on her shoulders lighten. But the real shock awaited her outside. On the courthouse steps stood a crowd, dozens of people, from young activists to elderly citizens with canes. They held signs, "Thank you, Jasmine. Truth wins." Among them was Marion Collins, a witness, now holding a small bouquet of daisies. "This is for you," she said, extending the flowers. "My husband always said small steps change the world. You took one today." Jasmine took the flowers, her throat tightening. "We did it together, Mary, and then something happened that no one expected. From a crowd stepped a man in worn jeans and an old baseball cap, Randall Cox. Without his uniform, he looked smaller, more vulnerable. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "Miss Crockett," he began, his voice breaking. Elite. I knew what we did was wrong. But I was afraid of losing everything. You showed me I lost more by holding on to that lie." The crowd fell silent. Reporters surged toward him, but Jasmine raised a hand, stopping them. "Why are you saying this now?" she asked quietly. "Because I saw how you fought. Not with fists, not with screams, but with words. And I realized I could do the same. I'm going to the department. I'll tell everything. Maybe it'll ruin me, but I don't want to be part of that wall anymore." Silence hung heavy before the crowd erupted into applause. Tyler stepped toward Cox and extended a hand. "I won't forgive you," he said, "but I respect this." Cox nodded, and they shook hands, a moment captured forever by the cameras. Jasmine stood apart, feeling euphoria mixed with exhaustion. She hadn't just won a case. She had shifted something bigger, something that could ripple outward. Walsh had acknowledged her strength. Cox had chosen truth. Tyler had found justice. And people, ordinary people, believed their voices mattered. As she walked to her car, the sun was setting, painting the Dallas sky in gold and pink. She knew the fight wasn't over. But today was a beginning of change that could bloom if people kept speaking.